and justice for all.
This republic has not always been, what it is today, and it's going to get better. I know it's getting worse right now. It seems like that, but I say that things are polarizing. Last week we talked about civil liberties, and those are just God-given, unalienable rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property, and no ex post facto laws, no bills of attainder, no titles of nobility, and freedom of religion, press, right to an attorney, right to remain silent, all of these criminal due process rights that we have all the way through the Eighth Amendment in the Bill of Rights. But today we're going to be talking about civil rights. We're not talking. It can be a little bit of confusion because it uses the same term rights. But we're not talking about unalienable rights here. When we talk about civil rights, we're talking about mostly what maybe some of us would call civil privileges or avoiding discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, sex. And so the key to understanding this entire section on civil rights is to understand what the first four things on here we call inherent characteristics. Inherent characteristics are just things that you and I are born with for the most part. And some of them we can't change. Our race, now we could change our religion, some people do, but most people don't. National origin, you can't change that. And your sex, I don't even want to talk about that. But it's, generally speaking, those are things that we're born with, and we're born with, and we can't be blamed for, right? And so the whole idea is that if that's our race, religion, national origin, or sex, then if there's a law passed in America that discriminates on the basis of that, that creates what the law calls suspect classifications. So those are all suspect classifications. If you have a law that discriminates on the basis of race or sex or any of those four, and we're going to talk about a couple of more. They're trying to get into that protected categories, but suspect classifications. And so for laws in those suspect classifications, the courts will look at an additional level of scrutiny. You got ordinary scrutiny, then heightened scrutiny, and then strict scrutiny. If you just have a law that says you can't spit on the sidewalk because it's dirty or something, if the state that's constitutional for them to do that, it may be a dumb law, but if we don't worry about tuberculosis anymore from spitting on the sidewalk, but if they want to do that, they can do that. It's just going to be an ordinary. But if they're going to say that Muslims or Mormons or Baptists or Catholics can or cannot do this or that, that's going to be looked at with a strict scrutiny. There better be a darn good reason. There better be a compelling state interest for there to be discrimination on that basis. And we're going to talk about discrimination that has gone on from day one here in America and how things have changed. I'm going through this pretty quickly because we have I generally do this in about 3 or 4 hours, so 2 or 3 classes. Indentured servitude. Before we had slavery in America, they had indentured servitude, which was just kind of like voluntary slavery. Someone would sign an indenture, a contract, and the rich guy would pay their way over the ocean and give them a job when they were over here. And they had an indenture for 3 years or 5 years or 7. I heard of one as long as 12 years. I don't really know what but you were pretty much a voluntary slave, and you couldn't buy your way out of it. If you inherited a bunch of money from Aunt Myrtle and said to your boss, I want to buy my way out, I'll pay so many $1,000, unless he wanted to do it, he could say, no, you're mine for the next 5 years, whatever your indenture was. When they started with slavery, started in England, and we picked it up real quickly, slavery was cheaper. And so slavery took over here in America. By 1776, when we had a country, the whole South the economy was based on slavery. So we had a real problem in 1776 when we said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, and that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. And that's what makes us the sovereigns, the source of law, because God is the sovereign. He made us sovereigns when He made us free, when He gave us unalienable rights. That's what Jefferson said, and we've said a bunch of times here. I know you've heard it before, you're going to hear it again.
How did they reconcile that?
They didn't reconcile it. I mean, that was the deal. In the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the northern states said, as you saw in the movie, slavery is heinous. It's ungodly, and we should get rid of it and so on. And the South said, maybe it is, but we're not willing to give it up right now because it would destroy our economy. And so there was a battle, and it did split them for a while. But the South came. Everybody knew, as Madison said, everybody knew that they had to accept the position of the South, that they would not get rid of slavery totally. But the South came prepared with two compromises. One was the 20-year compromise, and they said, and it was, what's his name, Rutledge, I think, from South Carolina, who proposed that they would include in the Constitution that from 20 years thereafter, which would be 1808, the importation of slaves in America would stop. Now, that doesn't stop slavery, but at least it stops the increase of slavery, they said. Well, of course, it didn't stop the increase of slavery either. They had babies just like everybody else was, but it did really slow things down in 1808. But we still had a big problem in America, and I call it a divine tension that had to be, and it wasn't resolved until the Civil War, when as Wilson from Pennsylvania, he said, nations can't be punished in this life, and so in the next life. And so they got to be punished in this life. And he said slavery will bring the wrath of God on America. We did resolve it with the Civil War. Now we're going to spend some time talking about that here. In fact, this whole first page is pretty much about slavery and the battle that was going on. But it was set, and we knew that it had to be resolved. The South knew that they had to eventually stop slavery. But by 1860, we still hadn't gotten rid of slavery. 1861 when the Civil War started. But prior to that, these under involuntary servitude or slavery, the first, I think, 6 or 7 things there. I just listed a bunch of items that brought to the attention of Americans this thing about, well, everybody knew that there were slaves there, but for example, I'm going to skip to the Underground Railroad first. I put this up here. The Underground Railroad, here's the South, here's the Mason-Dixon line, and the southern states, the 11 southern states had slaves. And the Underground Railroad was just, they used railroad terms, a system of safe houses, or they called them, and they had people where they would sneak slaves, runaway slaves, and they would help them get to a safe house until they could get up to, and they called those people engineers. Harriet Tubman is the most famous one. Obama wants to put her on the $10 bill instead of Andrew Jackson.
No,
He's
20.
Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, with a Republican, interestingly enough.
$20 bill.
And you know, I have a problem with Harriet Tubman being mentioned more in the history books than George Washington, but she was a true hero. There's not any question about it. She helped thousands of people as well, and in fact, over about a 40-year period, from 1810 to 1850, a little over 100,000. At the same time, we had the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act said if you help runaway slaves, then you can be fined $10,000 and a year in prison. That's a good way to make your life real tough if you have a family. So they were real heroes. They were risking a lot, those people that were trying to get, and a lot of them didn't stop here when they got to the north, because the Fugitive Slave Act still happened up here, and you could, if they felt safe and that it wasn't, the Fugitive Slave Act wasn't being, but the point here is that Americans became aware, much more aware of slavery because of the Fugitive Slave Act and the Underground Railroad. Another one here, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a famous novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. How many of you seen the movie The King and I with Yul Brynner and what's her name? Deborah Kerr. Or the more recent one with Jodie Foster and Sun Young Fat, whatever his name is. They're both of them great movies. And in the movie, they tell the story of this, I think it was the head of Siam at the time, the king, who wanted to be modern. He liked Abraham Lincoln, sent him a couple of elephants to work to help in the Civil War cause. But in this, in this particular story, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, it tells the story of Simon Legree, the vicious slave master, and so on. And they put on, he gets the king's, the nanny, gets the king's children to put on this play of Uncle Tom. Eventually, he realizes they're talking about him, and so he gets upset in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The point I want to make here with Uncle Tom's Cabin is, it was a famous, everybody in America knew about Uncle Tom's Cabin. In high school, when I was a kid, we were still doing plays about Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? It raised the awareness of people. Almost all of these not only raised the awareness, but got more people in America to get over the hump and to oppose slavery, discrimination on the basis of race. John Brown's Rebellion. John Brown was a, have you ever seen a picture of John around on the internet. He looks like they just plugged him in. Looks like Einstein, you know. But he started a slave rebellion. His idea was, I'll get a big slave rebellion. All the other slaves will see it, and they'll join in. There were more slaves than there were masters. Problem was they didn't have the internet, and the word didn't get around, and it didn't work. And the slave rebellion fizzled, and he was caught and hanged. And when I was a kid, we sang a song, John Brown's body lies molten in the grave. Yeah. Anyway, so John Brown, but everybody knew about John Brown and the slave rebellion. The Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri was coming into the Union, and the question was, what about Missouri and these other states that are coming into the Union? At that time, you had Missouri here, it's above the Mason-Dixon line, and Maine over here. And the question is, they wanted to be a slave state. Missouri wanted to be a slave state. They did not up here. So the compromise was, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, was that Missouri would be a slave state, Maine would not be a slave state, but all of the other states that would come in would not be slave states from then on out. That was the Missouri Compromise. It was a big battle, and again, Americans took sides, and slavery was becoming less and less popular in America. The emancipation, of course, we had the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. In the areas that were in rebellion against the United States. So slaves that were not in rebellion, I think about 1/3 was not in rebellion. And so those areas, we freed the slaves. And it was a good move as far as the military was concerned too. The Union troops knew that they were fighting to keep men free, to make men free, and the Southern troops knew that they were fighting to keep men slaves. And the Northern, sang the battle hymn of the Republic, because he died to make men holy, let him die to make men free. So it was a very law. I mean, he couldn't enforce it, as they said, they couldn't enforce it down there. But it was a good PR move, I think. All of those things were ones that were over a 50, 60-year period that were getting to people. And of course, the Civil War pretty much solved it, except that once the war was over in the United States, but it was, and so what we call the Civil War Amendments, 13, and sent out to the passed in I think 1868, and maybe this was 1871. I don't know about the 13 here. But before I get to those, we're all Democrat, by the way. The Southern legislatures, knowing that slavery is going to be done away with, passed what